But first, I'm joined by Simon, who is a former cricket player and now a cricket commentator. First of all, Simon, your reaction to what are at the moment only allegations, of course.
Well, I'm not surprised in a way, because I think that the Stanford, the whole issue of when he came into cricket was almost too good to be true. Arriving in his black helicopter, we've just seen pictures of that, with this case full of dollar bills, you know, sort of really throwing his money about. And cricket has never been like that. It's never had a person like that before. And I think really the ECB particularly will be thinking to themselves today, we were slightly hoodwinked by this guy. And, you know, he nailed his colours to the mast pretty early on.
People were seduced. England people were seduced.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, the backdrop to this, in a way, Kirsty, is that the Indians sort of jumped the gun with this new form of the game, 2020 cricket, which the British, the English sort of invented, but then the Indians ran away with and created the Indian Premier League for huge amounts of money, paying the players massive sums, and suddenly the ECB were sort of caught napping.
So along comes Stanford.
Along comes Stanford. He's almost like a sort of fairy godmother,
yes,
to kind of allay all the problems of money, and suddenly a sweetener to the players. A
sweetener to the players. $1 million per player. I mean, presumably he wasn't thinking he could... Well, let's just deal with the cricket. I know it's minor compared to the allegations, but presumably he didn't make a penny out of that.
No, I mean, it was all a publicity scheme for him, clearly,
right,
to try and get presumably some kind of credibility in European business markets. I mean, nobody's quite sure what his agenda was, but from the ECB's point of view, it was money sort of falling off trees to give to the players as a sweetener for the fact that they hadn't got a big 2020 tournament going.
So you think that the very fact that he was a fairy godmother, they perhaps didn't do due diligence?
I can't really say that. I don't know, but I think that the ECB, one or two of the people in the ECB are a bit inclined to jump the gun and go for things a little bit without perhaps fully checking. And, you know, the players would have loved it initially. But I think the other problem with Stanford, and what we sort of really realised very early on, was that he was making a bit of a mockery of the game and making cricket into a sort of reality TV show rather than an actual match.
Simon, thank you. Well, we can turn now to Jacob Frankel, who joins us from Toronto. Good evening. You heard perhaps Professor Coffey in our film saying there that if these allegations are proven to be true, we could be talking about a bigger fraud than Madoff.
Well, I question whether it's going to be a bigger fraud than Madoff, but in terms of...
If Madoff is indeed a fraud, I should say.
Well, and again, whether it's Madoff or whether we're talking here in terms of Mr. Stanford, it's only allegations. The difference, though, in Madoff is we actually have Mr. Madoff having made admissions, those admissions having been brought into the public domain by federal prosecutors and by the SEC. But you're right, there is the potential here that the breadth of the allegations that the SEC has made really could be beyond those that have been made against Mr. Madoff.
Yeah, I mean, what the authorities that we're talking about today were tentacles that stretched around the world. I mean, how far would the effect of these events be felt?
Well, as with all of these investigations, we don't really know, and I think what that really does is take us to really what is the current status of affairs in the United States. The SEC, the securities regulator, FINRA, have conducted an investigation. That is what has resulted in the SEC bringing us charges, freezing the assets as it has today. In this kind of case, it is inevitable that there is a parallel criminal investigation that could result in criminal charges. What is going on outside of the United States, to what extent, if any agencies outside the United States, foreign regulators, are cooperating with the U.S. regulators, that's something that we don't know. We'll only find out over time. But what we really have here is urgency that gets created for anybody who has invested directly or indirectly in any of the Stanford operations.
Do you think that the SEC is perhaps acting with more vigor than it did in the past?
Well, there's no question that the SEC will be acting with considerable vigor beyond what we've seen in the past few years. What's different here also from Madoff is the SEC has acknowledged that it has been conducting this investigation involving Mr. Stanford and his operations and other officials within the United States for a number of months. And when you look at the actual charging documents, you see a robust set of allegations which are necessary to be able to obtain the asset freeze that the SEC went to court and did obtain.
Now, I mean, I don't know if you were able to get much of our film, which actually related to a lot to Mr. Stanford's involvement in Antigua, but you can imagine on an island like Antigua, his very absence from the economy, if indeed that's what happens, will make a massive difference.
There's no question, and I think one of the things that's particularly striking about how the SEC reported what it did today is typically the SEC will acknowledge the assistance of other regulators who help with the investigation. And it often does that with the FSA, for example, when it works together with the FSA. There was no acknowledgement of any assistance from the Antiguan authorities. So, there is certainly the possibility that someone as significant or as perceived with the level of significance to the Antiguan economy as Mr. Stanford there could be some level of protection or desire on his part, if he in fact is in Antigua, to stay there. And there are one of the other issues I think that's critical, as different from Madoff. In Madoff, everything was in the United States. There was a freeze of assets in the United States, and there was an effort to go beyond and bring assets back in. Here, I think there's an acknowledgement that even though there's an order that requires repatriation of the assets to be brought back for the receiver as part of the broader asset freeze, it's not possible to make the bold assumption that the courts of Antigua or even other courts will necessarily acknowledge the validity of those orders. So I think there's a lot that still needs to play out here.
Just one final question. You probably heard the phrase there. We don't yet know who's been swimming naked, and we won't know until the tide goes out. Do you think the SEC is going to have any number of these kinds of investigations?
Absolutely. I mean, this is not the second, if you want to consider Madoff the first. The SEC brought somewhere between 6 and 10 of these cases just since the 1st of November. I think it's very much a function of the economy. People making demand, and certainly fallout from Madoff. People making demands for distributions, greater accountability, evaluating who are the experts who are providing advice. I think we're likely to see many more, not just in the United States, but also outside the United States, because economic conditions are ripe for these frauds to become known, where in better conditions, people tend to be more complacent about their investments.
Thank you both very much indeed. And of course, as such, Alan Stanford is still only allegations of fraud. Well, according to the SEC, Alan Stanford's investment companies were exposed to the losses from the alleged Ponzi scheme run by Bernard Madoff. Many Stanford investors will now be looking at the fate of Madoff's clients, many of them his friends and neighbours on Palm Beach. While Madoff is under house arrest in Manhattan, they are counting their losses. Michelle Fleury reports from Palm Beach.